Hello. This is going to be a hard lesson for me to do because today we're going to be talking about an issue which affects many people that I know. It affects people that I'm close to, people that I love. Today we're going to be talking about the issue of adultery and divorce. So stay tuned for this week's lesson. Hello, welcome to this week's lesson. I'm Brian Vermeer, and before we begin, I'd just like to remind you, if you enjoy these videos, please leave a like and subscribe to the Mr. Vermeer's Class YouTube page. Follow the Mr. Vermeer's Class Facebook page, and if possible, if you can, please support me on Mr. Vermeer's Class on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Vermeer. This is going to be a hard topic, as I said, because all of us know people, love people who have been affected by divorce. And when I started this series on the Sermon on the Mount, I said, I wanted to just go through it verse by verse and explain what Jesus said and what Jesus meant. And that's what I'm going to try to do. And I may say some things that you don't want to hear. I may say some things that you may say, well, that doesn't apply to me. I'm just going to teach it the way I feel, God is leading me to teach this. That's the best I can say. There are some who may say that I'm not qualified to talk about divorce because I've never been through it. And fortunately, I've been blessed. I've had a happy marriage for almost 29 years now. And that doesn't mean my wife and I have always gotten along. That doesn't mean we've always seen eye to eye on everything. We've had problems. We've had arguments. We've had heated discussions sometimes. But, when I get to that part, I'm going to talk a little bit about the attitude, I think, our attitude, at least, that we had going into our marriage, and how I think that might be able to help some of you who are considering getting married. So let's just go ahead and get started here in Matthew chapter 5. Let's take a look at verses 27 and 28. Jesus is talking about the law, and he's had his statement, don't think I've come to destroy the law, and now he's going through several parts of the law. Probably parts that he felt, his audience, really needed to hear about. What did God really mean when he gave these commandments? Remember, we've been saying that God judges our intentions more than he does our actions. So let's see what Jesus has to say about this commandment. Matthew 5, verses 27 and 28. Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So Jesus is quoting another commandment here, one of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. And there are people back then, there are people today who think, well, that means I can do anything I want to with another woman as long as I'm not actually having sex with someone who is not my wife. Now, first of all, let me clarify a couple of things. Remember, Jesus is speaking to Christians. He is talking to his disciples, to people who are followers of Christ. Now, that does not mean that people who are not Christians are free to commit adultery. People who are not Christians are going to do what they want to do anyway. And Jesus says they're already condemned. They're not condemned because they commit adultery. They're condemned because they haven't believed in John chapter 3. So we don't need to be stressing even any type of sexual immorality. I think as Christians, we've had a problem recently in that we've been condemning non-Christians for their natural behavior. You know, it's not right for me, for example, to tell a non-Christian, you shouldn't be homosexual. Now, while I agree with that, where I need to start is you need to know Jesus. That's where we need to be starting with people like that, with people who do not profess to be Christians. I can't tell someone who is not a Christian that he needs to follow a Christian code of ethics. I do not need to be telling someone who does not believe the Bible, well, you shouldn't do that because the Bible says. He's not going to accept that as a valid argument. So remember, Jesus is just speaking to Christians. He's just speaking to people who claim, who profess to be his followers. Another thing, this is just kind of a little nitpicky point. Let's stress here between the difference. The Bible uses a couple of words. It uses the word adultery and it uses the word fornication. Now, what's the difference? Adultery is a married person having sexual relations with someone who is not that person's spouse. If I were to have sexual relations with someone who is not my wife, then I would be committing adultery because I am married to my wife. Fornication is someone who is not married having sexual relations with anybody. And the Bible forbids that as well. The Bible stresses quite a bit. Sexual relations are reserved only for married couples. That's part of God's gift. When God presented Eve to Adam, the first thing they did was they had a marriage ceremony. And Adam took Eve to be his wife. And in the confines of marriage, sex is a wonderful thing. But it is not to be used outside of the confines of marriage, whether you're married and doing it with somebody besides your partner, or whether you're single and doing it with anybody. That is all wrong. And I think that also kind of falls here under the do not commit adultery. We can probably put fornication here as well. But Jesus says, you've heard it was said, the commandment simply says, do not commit adultery. So the people at that time, looking for loopholes, said, well, that means I can still look at other women. I can still lust after other women. I can probably even still go so far as to touch other women in certain ways, or I can do anything I want with another woman, just as long as I don't actually have sexual intercourse with that woman. That's probably what what the people were thinking at that time. This is how we can get around and still not break the commandment. But Jesus tells us here what the commandment means is everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. God judges your intentions. God judges your attitudes before he judges your actions. And the key word here is the word lustfully. Now, you can't avoid looking at women. I was a school teacher for 17 years. I was in a building full of women. I had to look at women. I had to see women. The question is, how did I look at them? Did I look at them as just fellow teachers, or did I look at them as potential sex partners? That's the attitude that God is trying to judge here. If I look at another woman besides my wife and look at her as a potential sex partner, or look at her with the attitude that I would like to have sex with that woman, or even the attitude of looking at her so as to cause sexual arousal. Looking at a woman lustfully, what does that actually mean? I think that means looking at a woman with the intent to cause sexual arousal in yourself, whether you intend to do anything with that woman or not. Are you looking at that woman to just admire her beauty? Or are you looking at her so that you can become sexually aroused? That, I think, is the difference. I don't think there's anything wrong with admiring the beauty of another woman, as long as you're not letting it get you sexually aroused and you're not doing it for the purpose of becoming sexually aroused. My wife and I will see, a pretty actress on TV, and I'll tell my wife, I say, I think she's pretty. And this is why I think she's pretty. I think, I like, that particular hairstyle, or I like that particular, outfit she has on, or something like that. And it's not in a sexual manner. It's just, I think that is attractive. And sometimes my wife, hits me. Sometimes she doesn't. But the point is, there's a difference between that and I think I'm looking at a woman lustfully. And Jesus is simply saying here, don't look at someone else lustfully besides your partner. Now, there's nothing wrong with looking at your partner lustfully. There's nothing wrong with me looking at my wife in a lustful manner. Because again, sexual relations are reserved for a man and his wife. And that's what, and God wants me to find my wife sexually attractive. My wife wants me to find her sexually attractive. And, I think oftentimes some marriages fail because we lose that attraction. But that's part of being in love. I think if you are truly in love with someone, you will find them attractive that way. But let's go on now and see what Jesus says. Now, what should you do about this then? And this is another one of these, kind of hard sayings. So let's take a look at verses 29 and 30. Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. What is Jesus saying here? Is he literally saying that if I can't help but look at women lustfully, I should gouge out my eyes? Only if that's what it takes. Jesus is exaggerating here. I think, he's using absurd exaggeration. But what he's trying to say here is do whatever it takes to avoid sin. He's not saying if your right hand causes you to sin, then, cut it off. This may be where, the Muslims got the idea of if someone is caught stealing, you cut off his hands. That way he'll never, steal again. What Jesus is simply saying here is do whatever it takes to avoid falling into temptation to sin. In the movie Fireproof, starring Kirk Cameron, there's a scene, he plays a man who has been considering divorcing his wife, but he's, trying his best to make it work. And one of the problems that he had was pornography. Internet pornography is one of the problems that, he was dealing with. And when he made up his mind that he was going to be faithful to his wife and he was going to stop looking at the internet pornography, then one day he sits down at his computer and he's, doing something completely different when suddenly a pop-up ad for a pornography site comes up. He looks at it for a second and then he deletes the ad. But then a little later, another one pops up. And, there's this montage of him, just getting these over and over. And finally, you see him throwing away his computer. He decided, if that's what it takes for me to not give in to that sin, then I'm going to throw away my computer. Jesus says here, you're going to be tempted. Satan knows what your weaknesses are. Satan knows what your favorite sin is. And Satan is going to give you ample opportunity to commit it. And Jesus is simply saying, do whatever it takes. If it means getting rid of something, then do it. If it means making sacrifices, then do it. If you have a problem with alcoholism, don't go to bars. If you have a problem with pornography, Don't go to the shops that sell the magazines. Don't get on your computer. I know that's hard these days. We practically rely on our computers for everything. But do what it takes. Do whatever it is you have to do to avoid falling into the temptation. And here talking about, looking at a woman lustfully, he says if it even means gouging out your eye, then that's what you do. Hopefully none of you would ever have to do that. I'm not condoning self-mutilation or anything here. But he's just saying you do whatever it is you have to do to avoid falling into sin, to avoid falling into the temptation to sin. You're going to be tempted, but the Bible promises you there's always a way out of the temptation. God will never put you in a situation where you have to commit the sin. There's always going to be a way that you can get out without committing the sin. And now the part that I'm sure a lot of you came to hear. Let's look at verses 31 and 32, continuing on. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. But I tell you, everyone who divorces his wife, except in a case of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Well, first of all, let's take a look at what law Jesus is quoting here. In verse 31 here, Jesus says, it was also said that whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy 24:1, part of the law of Moses. Let's take a look at what that law specifically says. It says, if a man marries a woman, but she becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, he may write her a divorce certificate, hand it to her, and send her away from his house. So what the law specifically says is, if I find something indecent about my wife, and it makes her displeasing to me, all I have to do is write a statement saying, I divorce you, hand it to her, and we're divorced. That's what the law of Moses said. What did God intend by that law? Well, we're going to get into that in a minute here too. But the loophole they found here was, what's the definition of displeasing? And what's the definition of indecent? When it says she becomes displeasing to him, what that meant to many of the people then was, if I find anything about my wife that I don't like, if she snores, that makes her indecent and I'll find her displeasing and I can divorce her. If she burns the roast, that's something indecent and I find her displeasing and I can divorce her. It got to the point where people could divorce their wives for any reason they wanted. Probably even if they didn't want a reason. If I find another woman that I think I like better, that makes my wife displeasing to me because I don't like her as much now, so I can divorce her. But is that what God really intended when he wrote the law? Well, some Pharisees asked Jesus about this in Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9. So let's take a look at what they were saying here. Matthew 19, 3 through 9. It says, some Pharisees approached him, that is Jesus, to test him. They asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any grounds? Haven't you read, he replied, that he who created them in the beginning made them male and female? And he also said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Therefore they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. Why then, they asked him, did Moses command us to give divorce papers and to send her away? He told them, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of the hardness of your hearts, but it was not like that from the beginning. I tell you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So it says these Pharisees came to Jesus. They'd probably heard what Jesus said before. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality commits adultery. Now let's look at that word sexual immorality real quick, because he repeats it here. The word immorality in the original Greek is porneia. It's where we get our word pornography. And this can refer to a variety of anything that would be considered sexually immoral. So any type of sexual sin. And by the way, if I can just add a little side note here, I was challenged again this week. I was confronted again with the statement, Jesus never said anything about homosexuality. And that is true. Jesus never said anything specifically about homosexuality because he didn't have to. They knew that homosexuality was immoral. That would fall under this definition of porneia, of sexual immorality. His audience knew that. They didn't have a problem with it. They knew it was wrong. So he didn't have to say anything about it, and that's why he didn't. Paul, when talking to a Greek audience, which did allow homosexuality, did specifically condemn it. Read Romans chapter 1. So let me just clear that straight up. But they asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any grounds? Because that's what they were doing. They were divorcing their wives for any reason they wanted. And Jesus goes back to the beginning. He goes back to the book of Genesis. One of these days I want to do a verse-by-verse study of the book of Genesis, or at least say the first 11 chapters or so. But he goes back to the beginning, and this is one reason why I believe in a literal Genesis. I believe the first chapters of Genesis are to be taken literally, because Jesus here quotes them. He says, haven't you read that in the beginning he made them male and female? And by the way, those who say Jesus never said anything about homosexuality, he says here, God made them male and female, referring to the first married couple. That's the way God intended it. And then he also says, quoting Genesis 2:24 here, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. When you get married, when you have sexual relations in marriage as a Christian couple, you become one flesh. It is no longer you and me. It is us. It is no longer yours and mine. It is ours. And that's the attitude that you need to have going into a marriage. There are many marriages today that set themselves up for divorce because they go into it saying, well, I'm still going to have my bank account and you still have your bank account. We're going to keep it all separate. I'm still going to have my stuff and you're still going to have your stuff, and we're going to keep that separate. I'll have stuff just in my name. You have stuff just in your name. We're going to keep everything separate. What you're really saying is, just in case then we get divorced, it'll make it a whole lot easier. Don't go into a marriage with the attitude, well, if it doesn't work, we can just get divorced. When my wife and I got married, we had talks about this beforehand, many times beforehand. When we got married, our attitude was, divorce is not an option. Whatever it is, we're going to work it out. As Christians, what does Jesus tell us? If someone offends you, you forgive them. If they repent, especially, you forgive them. If you know you've offended someone else, you repent and you let them forgive you. If I do something that displeases my wife, I repent and she forgives me. If she does something that displeases me, she repents and I forgive her. That's the attitude that we're supposed to have as Christians. That's the attitude you're supposed to have in a marriage. Divorce should never come to mind. That should not be an option. in a Christian marriage. Now, I know some of you are going to say, well, you don't know what's been going on in my marriage. Well, no, I don't. And I know there are some things that happen that may seem unforgivable. That's why Jesus does have, certain outs here. He says, if you divorce your wife, except in a case of sexual immorality, that is, if the other person has done or is doing something sexually immoral. If the other person is cheating on you, if the other person is sexually abusing you, if the other person is, doing anything like that. And I think even physical abuse would fall under that category. And then the Apostle Paul goes on and says, if a believer is married to a non-believer, and the non-believer wants out of the marriage, then the believer is to let the non-believer go. But as a Christian, I should not ever want to initiate a divorce from my wife unless she is doing something sexually immoral. And even in that case, only if she is unrepentant. Otherwise, I should forgive her. I'm reminded of the preacher I heard once who told a story about a man who came to him who said, I don't love my wife anymore, hoping the preacher would recommend that they get divorced. He wanted approval for a divorce. He'd already decided that's what he was going to do. He said, I don't love my wife anymore. What should I do? And the preacher said, you go home and you love your wife. And the man said, you don't understand. I don't love my wife anymore. And the preacher said, no, you go home and you love your wife. Love is not a feeling. Love is an action. It is something that you do. I have to love my wife every day. I can't let the feelings that I have fall apart. And the way I keep the feelings from falling apart is I take the action of loving my wife every day. I do things. Just like when we were dating. What did I do to get her to fall in love with me? I need to keep doing those things. We still go out on dates, just the two of us. It's a lot easier now because our daughter's gone away to college. I've always put her first, even ahead of my daughter. And I think that's a cause of problems in a lot of marriages as well. People put the children ahead of the spouse. The spouse should always be ahead of the children. My daughter's not going to be with me forever. My wife is. I need to make my wife, outside of Jesus, I need to make my wife the most important person in my life. And I need to keep her the most important person in my life, and I need to treat her as if she is the most important person in my life. That's how you keep a marriage working. Jesus says, you're no longer two. You are one flesh. Everything that was you is now a part of me. Everything that is me is now a part of you. Therefore, he says, what God has joined together, let no one separate. We say this at our weddings. We say a lot of things at our weddings, but do we really mean what we say? When I married my wife, I promised, in rich and poor, in sickness and in health, I would keep only unto her for as long as we both shall live. With God as my witness, I said, I am going to stay with you until one of us dies. And that's what she said to me as well. And I meant it. And that's why when we have problems, we do what we can to work them out. We do whatever it takes to work it out. So the Pharisees asked Moses, or they asked Jesus, why did Moses, I like the way they said this, why did Moses command us to give divorce papers and to send her away in Matthew 19, verse 7? Moses didn't command them to give her divorce papers. He allowed them to. And Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of the hardness of your hearts. In other words, he said, I don't like it. Jesus says it wasn't like that from the beginning. That's not the way God intended it for it to be. God says, I don't like it. I don't want you to do it, but I'm going to allow you to divorce your wives. Simply because I know that if I don't, you'll find other ways to get rid of them. But then Jesus repeats, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. There are grounds that God allows. But divorce is not something that you go into a marriage even considering. You don't marry someone unless you're absolutely sure this is who I want to spend the rest of my life with. I think oftentimes we have problems today. I think people get married too soon. In several marriage seminars that I've attended, I've heard people say things like, don't get married until you've known the person for at least a year, for example, because people change with the seasons. And just because they're acting this way in the summer doesn't mean they'll be this way. They won't get, heavily depressed, in the winter. If there's any doubt, then don't get married. I think God will let you know when the time is right. I didn't get married till I was almost 28. I've been with my wife for over 28 years now. I've been married over half my life now. And it's not always perfect. It's not always easy. But it's succeeded. And I think God has blessed our marriage because, number one, we keep God first. We both attend church regularly with each other. We worship together. We love each other, even when we don't feel like it. I got my wife a coffee mug once that says, I love you more than coffee, but not always before coffee. Because when she gets up in the morning, sometimes she can be hard to love, but I still love her. I make a point to love her. I try to love her. She tries to love me, and I know that's one of the hardest things there is to do. So do whatever it takes. God did not intend for divorce to be a thing. If you've been in a divorce, I'm sorry. I wish it could have been happier. If your reason is sound, then that's okay. If you're realizing the reason was not sound, God forgives. We need to forgive. We need to do whatever it takes. Marriage is something that God instituted. It is something that God intended. In fact, actually, after this passage, the disciples asked Jesus, they said, "This is a hard saying. Who can take it?" And Jesus says, in effect, God doesn't intend for everyone to get married. If he doesn't intend for you to get married, then I think he'll give you, I think you won't have the desire for another person. You won't fall in love with another person and want to be married. The Apostle Paul once said that, it's better, if you're working in the Christian ministry, it's probably better if you're not married, because a wife can, keep you from doing things, for the ministry. But if you have a sexual desire for someone, he says it is better to get married than to burn with desire, to burn with passion. And I think God will let you know whether you should marry that person or not. And that's the important thing. Pray about it. Before you're married, pray about it. After you're married, continue to pray that God will bless your marriage. The important thing is keep working. Love your spouse. Even when you don't feel like loving your spouse, love your spouse. And do what it takes. I'll see you again next week.